So, as Deb said, we are looking this morning at a new mini-series called Good Grief. And I like that title. And so there's 3 weeks as part of this. This is week 1, looking at loss. And next week, we're going to be thinking through this whole idea of longing. And Ed will be speaking to us about what it means for us to long into the future. And then Andrew will be completing our series just in 3 weeks' time or 2 weeks' time, looking at this whole issue of lament. So loss, longing, and lament. And so this morning we're thinking about loss. And, I don't know if that's something right now where you think, you know what, this is a subject that's really relevant to me, or, I'm not quite sure whether this is something that is for me this morning. But, there's something for all of us. Throughout our lives, we know that we will face situations where we experience loss. There's an inevitability about it. We will all experience loss at various stages in our lives. And it's loss at a whole bunch of different levels. Ruth and I last night were out at seeing a comedian called Michael McIntyre over in Cardiff. It was great fun. And last minute tickets, it was great. But it was a late night. And you know what? We got home, the motorway was shut on the way home and, various things. And we got home and it was beyond midnight. And I'll tell you what, for me, that's a late night these days. And, this morning I got up and I was having my breakfast, Ruth, and I was just there thinking, my back's kind of a bit aching, feeling a bit, getting old. Not as old as Ed, admittedly. But I'm getting old. And there's something about change. There's something about change in our lives that also results in some loss of movement, in my case, and loss of kind of energy and being able to stay up late. But change inevitably brings loss. And often loss is also associated with a sense of pain at what we have lost. And so whether this morning, we're talking about more extreme forms of loss. And Hilary Mantel, I don't know if you've read any Hilary Mantel. She used to bring out the bodies, and various great books. So she's got this wonderful phrase, where she talks about this. And when she's talking about loss, she describes it as kind of like the extremes of loss. When she's talking about it, she says, there's something about frontline bereavement, she calls it. Frontline bereavement being things like, loss of a partner or perhaps loss of a parent or of a child. Real kind of really meaty, difficult issues of loss. But, for many of us, we know we will experience those times. And this morning, I want to address those, and I want us to think about what it means and how we can cope in the midst of loss, how we can move through that loss. But I also don't want to just sort of stay in that space this morning, but also to recognise that loss hits us at lots of different times and in different ways. It may be for us that, we experience loss through the loss of a job, or through, struggling with our finances, the loss of money in our lives. It may be that we experience loss in the breakdown of a relationship with someone else, and we experience some grief that comes out of that kind of experience. It can also be things like, I was really enjoyed last week hearing from Devo about their experience in being involved with Hope 2018. And the way that they were describing there, all the fun and the mission that they had throughout that week as part of Hope 2018, and that sense of kind of friendship and closeness that was built there, that sense of being on a mission together and that being really exciting. But as we all know, in kind of these kind of situations, when we're really close to people, then, these things come to an end. And you sort of find yourself almost grieving a sense of closeness and having a sense of loss for a great experience that you have had. So loss hits us in a number of different ways. I just want us to start by looking from the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible and reading from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. So if you've got your Bibles, if you could open them to Ecclesiastes. And if you haven't got your Bible here this morning, then the words are coming up on the screen as I speak. So Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And it's titled in the NIV, A Time for Everything. It says there's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. Slightly random one, that one. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to search and a time to give up. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to mend. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. Some very relevant words there from the book of Ecclesiastes. And it's interesting there just to note that there Ecclesiastes doesn't pass judgment on each of these times. It's not placing a value on these things. What it is saying, though, is that there is an inevitability about each of these stages. That life has seasons, and that each season may well hold loss and grief, as well as growth and opportunity. You know, every stage, whether it's birth and death, whether it's weeping and laughter, whether it's silence and speaking and so on, this poem doesn't evaluate the positives or the negatives of those situations, but it just says that they are realities, that there's inevitability about them. And so it raises for us the question of how do we get through loss well? When loss is a season, if you like, for us, when grief is a season in our lives, how do we get through those situations? Now, I use that word through advisedly because I think there's something about getting through loss and grief rather than getting over it. I don't think you get over those things, but you can, I believe, get through them with God's help. And so the first thing I just want us to pick up on this morning is that loss is unavoidable. Loss is unavoidable. There's no life without change, and there's no change without loss. There's no loss without pain. As I said at the start, things change. Your job changes, your friends can change, your finances can change, your health can change. And as things in life change, you can experience times of loss and of grieving for those things. However, I also want to say that whilst loss is unavoidable, I think there's something about grief that is a choice. We can choose to grieve. Grief is a choice. And I think often we may consciously choose to avoid grief because it's unpleasant, because it hurts. Most people, I think, will inevitably try and avoid anything that hurts. But I think it's a big mistake not to grieve, to stuff it away, or in some way to try and hide those feelings of sorrow. Because the next thing I just want us to recognise is that whilst grief is a choice, grief is also something that is healthy for us. Grief is healthy. In fact, I believe it's the only healthy choice. It's the only healthy response when you have a loss. And the converse of that, of course, is it's unhealthy to deny a loss. Grief is God's tool for helping us to get through the transitions in life. Grief is God's tool for helping us to get through the transitions in life. All life has change. Change brings loss. Loss brings pain. And grief is that process that helps us to deal with that change in a healthy way, in a way that acknowledges pain and doesn't bury it. And there's something, I think, there about, for all of us, that actually these are experiences that we go through that we would inevitably want to avoid, simply because they're painful. But they also are experiences, as Deb said earlier on, that we can all have experiences that open us up. And there's something about choosing to acknowledge the pain of loss that is also about choosing to open ourselves up to what the Lord would teach us and show us in that time. Loss opens us up and gives us, if you like, experiences and teaches us about things about life that we wouldn't otherwise get to experience and to know. To experience life to a depth that others won't have experienced. I don't know what your dreams are for your children. If you have children, grandchildren, whether you have in your wider family those who are young and are growing up. And when you think about them and you think about their lives, what your heart's desires are for them. I'm sure that there's lots of different things that we desire for our children. I'm sure many of us, though, wouldn't necessarily articulate things in this way. That we want our children to experience pain. We wouldn't say that. When I think about my son and my daughter, I don't automatically think, what I really want for them in their lives is that they experience pain and grief in their lives, because that's not something you'd want for anyone, in one sense. But I know that what I do want for my children is that I want them to grow up not kind of protected from the world, not in a cocoon, safe from all the kind of unpleasant things in life. What I do want as they grow up is to be prepared for life. And there's something about recognizing with this issue of grief and of loss that actually it's inevitable in our lives. And that it's a choice then to choose to grieve. And grief is healthy. And so whilst, we might look at our children and think, well, we would never sort of desire that for them, I think there's also a recognition this morning that actually we need to find healthy ways for ourselves to grieve well, to, if you like, have healthy grief. If you've got a wound and you choose not to clean it up and to dress it and to, you're not meant to put plasters on, are you? That's what's wrong. What you're meant to do, I don't know, whatever, clean up the wound. If you choose not to do that, then actually you are open to that wound festering and becoming bad. And there's something about loss, as we look at it, to say we want to be people who have a healthy approach to loss. And grief, if you like, is cleaning the wound. It's making sure that there is space for healing and for health. Rick Warren, who's got a lot of good things to say on this subject. His son tragically took his own life, and in Rick Warren, an American pastor, as he sort of was reflecting on this situation, he also reflected on some of his own responses to grief, and he describes himself as having a PhD in grief. He's kind of gone through it. He really has, actually, and it's quite moving. And he described it like this. He said, if I don't let my grief out in healthy ways, I will act it out in unhealthy ways. If I don't let it out in healthy ways, I will act it out in unhealthy ways. And if I'm completely honest, I look at my own life and I recognise a bit of that for me. That actually there are times in my life where I've chosen not to deal with emotions of pain. And actually what that's done is it's bubbled up in unhealthy ways in my life. I've acted it out in unhealthy ways. In what I've said, in the way that I've acted, in the things that I've done. These things, if we don't deal with them and be open about them, they can come out in our lives in unhealthy ways. Another way of putting it is this: when I swallow my grief, my body rejects it. When I swallow my grief, my body rejects it. It might be for you, that pain in your rear is there. Because actually you're keeping tensions inside of you that God never intended you to bottle up in your life. So if grief is healthy, if grief is a good response, we'd see it in God. And we do. We see in the way that God experiences life in Jesus, that he deals head on with issues of grief. We see Jesus in John 11, the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept, weeping as he enters into and experiences the pain of the loss of Lazarus. If you remember the story of Lazarus, one of Jesus' close friends. And Jesus comes to the tomb of Lazarus and sees Mary and Martha and a whole throng weeping and grieving for the loss of Lazarus. And we see Jesus weeping. Jesus expressing his sorrow and pain at the situation he sees. He's not someone who moved around the earth with an impassive heart. He was deeply affected by what he saw. And he saw and experienced. And we see him grieving. In Hebrews 5, speaking, I think, probably about the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus, before he died, is kind of kneeling down in prayer in the middle of the night, asking God to take this cup from him, asking that there's some way other than the cross, that he might get out of this situation. Please do that, God, but your will, not mine. We see in Hebrews 5, speaking, I think, probably of that passage. It describes Jesus crying out with fervent cries and tears. Jesus was someone who experienced loss, and he was someone who processed that loss and who grieved. And so just as we think about that, I also want us to reflect on the fact that God, when we grieve, God grieves with us. God grieves with us. There's a wonderful psalm, Psalm 34, that puts it like this, that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and he saves those who are crushed in spirit. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. When we grieve, when we're broken in heart, when we experience loss, we know that God is close to us. The Message paraphrase puts the same verse in this way. It says, if your heart is broken, you'll find God right there. If your heart is broken, you'll find God right there. There are many verses in the Bible that talks about how through it all, God is faithful. God is faithful to us. And there are many scriptures that remind us of God's faithfulness in times of mourning. He's with us. That famous psalm, Psalm 23. Even though we pass through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me, God. When David was experiencing sorrow, he used these wonderful words in Psalm 56. Speaking to God, he says, you've kept count of my tossings and put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? You've kept count of my tossings, put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? It's a touching image there of how God, almost as of God catching our tears, which is full of meaning. When we experience grief, God is near. And just as I was walking down to church this morning, actually, I was thinking about this morning, and just felt the Lord speak to me through a verse from 2 Peter. In 2 Peter, the Lord it says that the Lord is not slow in keeping his promises. I'm going to butcher the reference. I probably ought to bring it up. I'm going to read it just in case I misquote. It says this: But do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise. And, for some of us, I want to just speak this morning into that. I'm aware for some of us, we are experiencing, that front line sense of grief and loss this morning. And sometimes going through those situations can feel like a day is like 1,000 years. But also, I just want to remind you this morning of that promise from 2 Peter, that actually the Lord is close, but also he is not slow in keeping his promises. He's near. He is faithful. The fourth thing I just want to point out as part of this is that grief is healed in community. So loss is unavoidable. Grief is a choice. Grief is healthy. God grieves with us. But that also grief is healed in community with one another. It was wonderful last week for those of you that were able to join us, just to gather around and to be praying for the Willoughbys. And as part of that, we sung a really wonderful song together that sung those words. Even through the valley, you are faithful. You turn situations for our good. And just as we were praying for the Willoughbys, who, experiencing multiple health challenges right now, many of you will be aware of, and just as we were crying out to God, really, for their healing, and that also that God would be close to them at this time, and that they would know that for themselves. I was just really kind of struck by something that someone said when they said, this is church at its best. This is church at its best. And I think there's something in that, As God's church, stand with others who are experiencing pain, who are experiencing loss and grief, we can see church at its best. In Galatians 6, it describes it in this way, that we're to carry each other's burdens. In Romans 12, it describes the church as being the place where we mourn with those who mourn. And of course, also rejoice with those who rejoice. And that's part of our experience as church. We bring comfort to those who need it. We bring God's solace to those who need to experience that. In 2 Corinthians 1, Paul is describing things in this way, and it says in verse 3, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of all compassion and the God of all comfort." And as I was reading this passage, it really struck me because there's something here in 2 Corinthians where Paul is talking about this Father of compassion and the God of all comfort. And later on in Corinthians, Paul talks also about how God has put a thorn in his flesh. And that actually it's a real sticking point for him. It's something he's struggling with. It's something he's praying for God to take away. And yet in the same letter to the Corinthians, he's able to describe God as the Father of compassion, the God of all comfort. And Paul here seems to be living in that place for him, where whilst he desires his circumstances to change, he recognizes that there's a God of all compassion, a God of all comfort, and a Father of compassion. And at times when we are experiencing loss and grief, for each one of us as God's people, we are called to come and to bring his comfort to those who need it. I wonder, Gavin, can you just switch on to the slide that talks about how we're to bring God's comfort? This passage in Corinthians talks about how God comforts us. but God comforts us for a purpose, and that's to comfort others. God comforts us, but we are to comfort others. And in fact, if you want to be a bit more strict about it, in this passage from 2 Corinthians, it actually says God comforts us through others to be a comfort to others. That actually God uses each one of us to be a comfort to others. And just very briefly, I just want to say one thing about that. And that's this, because I think it's important sometimes we recognise this. That comparing experiences we've had of loss and of grief isn't always a comfort to other people. Us being a comfort to others doesn't mean that we compare things that have happened in our life to what they're going through and say, well, I understand. Because everyone's grief and everyone's sense of loss is different, is individual, is tough in its own way. Being a comfort to others is, though, recognising that the comfort we have received from God, we want to share with others. And comfort is about standing alongside, about loving, about praying, about seeking God's encouragement and God's truth in a situation. It doesn't mean necessarily that you bring comparison with any situation that you have faced in your life. You know, God doesn't always deliver us from difficult times. But I do believe he can deliver us through those difficult times as we can pass on that comfort to others. God comforts us through others to comfort others. And just the last thing I want to for us to reflect on as we close is that grief is healed in community, but that grief is something that does come to an end. Grief has its own timetable, and you can't rush it. And as I said at the start, you don't get over grief, you get through it. But I was really struck, actually, as I was watching a talk by a rabbi, actually, by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. And he was describing how in the loss of his father, it took him kind of over 2 years to really kind of get through quite a deep, difficult time of grief as he sort of struggled to come to terms with the loss of his dad. And he described it like this. He said, I felt an existential black hole in my life, an emptiness at the core of my being. And it deadened my sensations, leaving me unable to sleep or to focus, as if life was happening at a great distance, and as if I were a spectator watching a film that was out of focus with the sound turned off. He describes that it was almost like he was a spectator watching a film out of focus with the sound turned off. But he said what he recognised was that he was trying to speed up, if you like, his recovery from grief. And what he recognised that actually was that grief had its own agenda, its own timetable, that he needed to give time to process his emotions and his life. Not to bottle it up, but to let it out in healthy ways. And in doing so, he found that there was an end to that period of time. It felt like a long time for him, but it was one that ended. And we know, of course, ultimately, there's an end to all grief. These wonderful words from the end of the Bible, from Revelation. In verse 4, chapter 21, verse 4, where it says, He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Grief can come to an end in our lives. And so this morning, what I want to encourage you to do and to process a bit this morning is to recognise that change is inevitable, that things happen, that loss is inevitable in our lives. But also to recognise that there will be times in our lives where we are particularly going through that times of intense feelings of loss. But what I want us to also recognise this morning is that we don't always realise it. We don't always realise it. That actually, whether through consciously suppressing thoughts in our lives or repressing them, kind of whether it's conscious or unconscious, we can all kind of push that pain down and not acknowledge it. And this morning, I just want us to recognise as a church that there can be hidden grief for each one of us. And this morning, just to do business with that, really, to bring that to God and to say, for those who are currently grieving, perhaps for those of us who recognise that there are areas in our lives where we've never fully processed, we've never fully brought things to the fore, that we want to bring that to God. That we want to process our grief and our sense of loss in healthy ways. That we want to, again, in appropriate ways, to be talking with our friends, with those who we're close to in and around church, that we might have those who will stand with us, to mourn with us as we mourn. But also for all of us to recognise this morning, that whether you are currently experiencing loss and the pain that comes with that, or whether you recognise that right now is not that season for you, but that it will come. That it is our calling for each one of us to be people who comfort those who experience pain and grief, to stand with them and to share God's comfort.